Good morning, everyone. My name is Tim Phillips. I'm from eSig Intelligence. Thank you very much to the Arena team for inviting me to kick off this day of the nicotine segment of the Nicotine and Cannabis Strategies conference, virtual conference. Very sorry that we're not, we're not there together. It's obviously sad, but hopefully this gets some way to filling the gap. Obviously I'm really glad to be coming back. I think we've been involved in this event now for many years, so it's good to be back with you. So one of the things just to point out on the first slide here is that you'll notice another logo. We've launched a secondary service called Tobacco Intelligence, and I'll come to some of the data from that, but we're focused on heated tobacco and nicotine pouches and other alternatives. So this is very much more widening our scope of analysis to include other products, not just vaping. Vaping, though, through eSig Intelligence is still very much our mainstay, if you like. What I'm going to talk about today, not very long. I've got 15-20 minutes to really try to summarize the huge changes that are going on in the market as a result of everything that's going on. Of course, we're going to be talking about COVID-19 and the impact that that's had on the market. And we'll talk a little bit about some of those things, but also, of course, the longer term impact of the EVALI crisis, the US Vape Crisis, the problems with the lung issues in the US, and what impact that's had on Europe. We'll talk a little bit about some other European developments that are happening this year. I'll, as I said, mention a bit about heated tobacco and nicotine pouch, and I think it's really important to start looking at those in the context of the wider nicotine market. And then we'll just end up with talking about some of the next steps in Europe. So COVID-19 impact, what hasn't it affected, I guess? But here are just a few of the things that we think are going on with the vape market, particularly at the moment. It's too early to really be able to say with any certainty what the long-term future impact is going to be. And I think it's really too early yet to understand. I mean, no one really understands what will really happen going into next year and beyond. But here are some things that are, that we've noted and we've been talking to with a lot of people in the industry. First of all, obviously, retail changes. So consumers are buying in different places. Real obvious thing to say here, but online grew massively during lockdown. Of course it did. We've seen how well Amazon and online retailers like those guys are doing, but also it's had a very beneficial impact on some of the multi-brand online retailers that we track. I'll show you some data that kind of backs that up. I think the big question is whether this is going to be a permanent consumer change and that consumers are really going to move into purchasing online because they get better prices and that works for them, or are they going to go back to the channels they were using before, namely the vape stores and convenience store channels. So we'll talk about that. Vape stores in general, I think, had a pretty bad lockdown in Europe, maybe worse than equivalent vape stores in the US. I think a lot of vape stores in the US were deemed to be essential services and remained open. That wasn't the case throughout Europe, although in some of the major markets they were. So there was certainly some confusion in markets like the UK where some of them stayed open and then were forced to close. Unfortunately, I think a lot of vape stores also took the view that they didn't want to open and they didn't feel it was suitable and protected enough. So I think vape stores had a pretty bad time. On the other hand, convenience stores and particularly tobacconists have done really quite well through lockdown. Most of them stayed open throughout the European region. They continued to sell cigarettes, of course, and there's a big question about whether consumers who were dual using vape and combustible cigarettes have gone back towards cigarettes. I think there's some evidence to suggest that is happening. And certainly we think that dual usage will have gone down. The dual users are the ones that are more likely to have gone back to smoking. We think most of the solus users that were only vaping would have stayed with the category. But also, again, this kind of growth that some of the tobacconists and convenience stores have seen in terms of sales of e-cig products The question remains whether that's going to continue through into next year, and in many cases it will. But I think there's a big question mark over whether this is still a discretionary spend rather than an ordinary route to market for consumers. So that's the retail side. We've got some down trading, and we're likely to see further down trading. We've got a bit of evidence suggesting that there is some price decay, and also brands that are low cost brands tend to have done very well during certainly the lockdown in the first half of this year. So will that continue? And I think if we continue to see economic problems into next year, then that might well be the case. Having said that, though, trusted brands are also a big issue, and I think the consumer trust in the products that they're using is a major reason for choice of products. So that's going to have an increasing impact going forwards, and it's also going to have an impact as we bring in more regulations into the sector. Final 2 points here. So hardware use, we've anecdotally heard that, of course, because there's been much less out of use home, there's a lot fewer people going out, we thought that might promote use of larger open system devices. The need to be able to slip something into the pocket before you go away or go out seemed to have been reduced during this lockdown period. In actual fact, I think a lot of the evidence we've got from Europe is suggesting the opposite's happening. We've got this general move towards smaller systems, both open and closed system pod and microtank devices. So I think that's not having an awful lot of impact, but it's certainly something to think about. And then the final point is just that in terms of regulations and the general move around debating the policy for e-cigarettes, a lot of the regulatory processes got stalled. A lot of the government processes in order to bring in new laws got stalled. In many ways, that was a positive advantage for the sector because it slowed down the bringing in of further restrictions on the sector. Okay, so a few numbers just to look at. Here's a first slide on looking at this move to online, which I talked about. So there's very clearly here, if we look through the first 6 months of 2020, we can see that there's been a very clear move towards online, an increase in traffic. So we started this COVID tracker, and we've been tracking traffic on the leading online retailers throughout all the markets that we look at. And you can see in this slide that it's divided into the various different regions. But very clearly, Europe and the US, North America, are showing big increases in traffic as lockdown started to bite in March and April this year. What does look like happening, though, is that the big increases seem to have come back down. So the traffic that obviously allowed a lot greater sale through the online channel seems to have dwindled in subsequent months. So we're yet to see whether this is permanent or not. I think it probably will have a bit of an impact. Consumers that may not have been used to buying online were forced to do so during lockdown, and a proportion of those will continue to do so. But certainly in terms of traffic, we're seeing the numbers come back down. The next slide is talking a little bit about down trading. So in the UK particularly, we looked at ranking for some of the leading online retailers. And I think what's quite interesting is that the retailers that really benefited from the lockdown, and in this case, we're looking at the differences between ranking and traffic in February compared to March. So just as the lockdown in the UK started to kick in. I think, one brand that really is rather interesting here is 88 Vape. It's a low cost brand, and they really benefited from this lockdown. So I think that's starting to show some evidence that down trading may well be happening, may well have happened during lockdown, but it's probably likely to continue to happen going forwards, I think. Good. All right, we'll talk about EVALI now. In many ways, I think the US lung crisis had more of an impact on the vape sector in general than COVID-19 has or will have. It was really a fundamental watershed for a lot of the industry. It hit the US first, but it's had a knock-on impact around the world. This slide just talks a little bit about some of the regulatory aspects, and I guess, you know, we've talked in lots of detail about the immediate impact on the market for the US vape crisis, but I think what we're starting to see now is the much longer tail impact of EVALI on public policy, on the media debate, and ultimately on regulations coming through. So what we've seen in the US immediately, we saw restrictions that were brought in, not directly as a result of EVALI, but a lot of them were brought in, you know, very soon after, which it seemed to coincide with the media frenzy around vaping in the US. It's already the restrictions that were brought in during that period have had an impact on more than a quarter of the US population. So really quite a big impact. And I know, you know, from anecdotal stories and some of the data that we have, just what impact that had, particularly on vape stores and retailers. But more widely, and of course, because we're focused on Europe, we really ought to focus on Europe. But I mean, I think it's really interesting to look at the impact that EVALI has had around the world. We've had direct impact on the US neighbors, Canada and Mexico. The public policy debate there has really changed quite dramatically. What we're seeing as well is a number of countries around the world are using what happened in the US as an excuse to do things that perhaps they were already wanting to do. And I think that's another sort of angle to this. So whilst it may not be directly attributable to the US vape crisis, a lot of restrictions that are being brought in now are using this as one of the reasons as to why restrictions are being brought in. So you can see that list there. This is again since sort of middle of last year, but we've had an online ban in China, we've had a total ban in India, we've had loads of restrictions being brought in some Asian markets. And then just those last two, Denmark and the Netherlands most recently. I mean, the Netherlands are now looking to bring in quite strict flavour restrictions, and they're looking at plain packaging. The period for consultation is very short. I think it ends the 18th of this month, and the laws are likely to come in early next year. So this is being rushed through pretty fast, and some of it definitely can be attributable to what's happened in the US and the rest of the world. Other things coming up, obviously European-wise, we've got the tax directive. It's looking very much towards the European Commission seems to be minded to bring in some kind of tax directive which applies to vaping. Clearly, they're going to be bringing it into some of the other alternative products like heated tobacco and so on. But we've also got various other key policy debates and decisions coming through. So we've got COP9. It's been delayed, but clearly that some of what happened in the US will be reflected in that WHO report that I've noted down there. And then of course we've got the TPD3 discussions, which will likely start next year, perhaps start of 2022. But you know, these are likely to be kicking off fairly soon. So I think the impact internationally has been huge. Just to I guess frame that as well, this slide is showing how different regulations are for the vaping category around the world. I won't go into the detail of it. This is our regulatory burden index, which we publish. But suffice to say that the darker colours are much higher or heavier restrictions. And you can see just how different some of these countries are, with quite a lot of certainly Southern Hemisphere countries applying quite strict restrictions on vaping. Very different to some of the other markets, particularly in Europe and the US, of course. Well, right, the US arguably is pretty strict now as well, of course. But I suppose what I'm saying is that there are varying degrees of outlook for this category, and whilst rather interestingly, I'm recording this today, the day that the PMTA filing deadline comes in, so Thursday, the 9th of September, the day before this conference. But of course, that will provide some certainty going forward. It's very different to the situation in, let's say, India, where the product's completely banned. So I think we're going to get some perspective on some of these things. Difficult, though, I know the PMTA is going to be for many operators. All right, what does it mean for our market expectations? Well, here's a couple of charts just showing how we changed our estimates as a result of both EVALI and COVID. You won't be surprised to know that we are much more negative than we were kind of this time last year. So our estimates in terms of US market, we were predicting a 20% growth into 2020, and our numbers are always midterm. We're now predicting a 14% decline in the US market, and it's not just the US. We're seeing a lot of the impact of this also come through in other markets as well. So our global numbers are also going down. They were going up 14%, and they're now going down 8%. So rather a negative outlook, I'm afraid, on the growth of the sector going forwards. Okay, some other things to be thinking about. So in Europe, we put this slide together, which I think is of interest, just to talk a little bit about the changes in consumer behaviour. We're seeing a big increase. Now, this is actually not tracking consumer behaviour, this is tracking products that are offered. So we're actually trying to look at all the products that are being offered in the leading markets around the world. If we pull together all the European products, what you can see here, quarter by quarter, through this is our brand tracker, which is really looking at every single product that is out there on the leading online retailers around the world. Here in Europe, we're seeing that there's a huge growth in pods, and the pod sections are those sort of slightly dirty green and lighter green at the top of the chart. There is just clear indications that pods are really growing quite fast. They're a bit slower than they were to take off in the US, but they're here to stay. And as I say, one of the things that's rather interesting about pods in Europe is, despite the nicotine limits that we have, the nicotine concentration limits in Europe of 20 milligrams per milliliter, pods are still very much here to stay, and we're also seeing a big increase in nicotine salts as well. So these pod products are, they're growing in popularity. They're here despite what we might say is a driver in the opposite direction, that people are not going out and so don't need these particularly portable devices any longer. But consumers still want the small portability and the ease of use of a pod product. So I think that's a pretty interesting dynamic that's happening right now. I said I would talk about some other products, and I'm running out of time, so I'm going to go through these pretty quickly, but we, as I said, are now tracking in quite some detail some other nicotine products. Firstly, heated tobacco. Really what's been happening in the heated tobacco segment, I guess, and this is not news to most people, but there was a time, maybe a couple of years ago, where heated tobacco was seen as very much an Asian phenomenon. It was something that was definitely happening quite strongly in markets like Japan and Korea, but didn't seem to be happening anywhere else. I think that's completely reversed now. We've seen heated tobacco roll out in a lot of countries around the world, and we're starting to see some really successful markets start to grow. So in Europe particularly, I would kind of pull out Italy, Greece, Romania, some of the Baltics, where the markets are not huge, but the incidence rate of heated tobacco use is really quite comparable to markets like Japan and Korea. So we're suddenly seeing markets take off. And as you can see from this map, the rollout process has been pretty consistent as well. So we're really starting to see heated tobacco products all around the world. Similarly, I think some other interesting issues are coming up. So we're starting to also see a lot of the manufacturers that were mainly Chinese, that were producing e-cig hardware, and now pretty much to a man are now producing heated tobacco hardware of some sort. All of this heated tobacco hardware is compatible with some of the leading products, namely, Heat and Glow and various others. But we're certainly seeing in some markets, particularly Japan and Korea, but also markets like Russia now, where we're seeing a lot of compatible products that are not tobacco brand products coming into the market. And I think that presents quite an interesting new dynamic. And there are various issues with that that may crop up, namely that a lot of the products, the hardware, operates at different temperatures to the temperatures that they may have been designed to be used with. And then we're also seeing that knock-on impact on how they get treated from a regulatory perspective. So, I think this space is really starting to become quite interesting, and is certainly one to watch. We've, in terms of this point about the market moving away from just being a Japan and Korea market towards a global market, I think you can see that from this slide. The bars are the percentage of the market, going up to 2020 and then beyond with our predicted market sizes. But you can see how much of the market we estimate to be outside of Japan and Korea, and also with these lines. So the Japan and Korea market is the blue line, which is is relatively sort of steady and static now, whereas the growth in that red line, which is markets outside of those two countries, is where all the growth is right now. So that's really reflective of what's happening, and it's reflective of what's happening in Europe as well. Slide about nicotine pouches. Just again, it's quite early to be saying an awful lot about nicotine pouches, but there's a lot of interest in them. We're seeing a lot of interest, funnily enough, from the vape category. So we just got some data back from our annual vape store survey in the US, and a lot of vape stores, there's like twice as much interest in nicotine pouches from vape stores this year compared to last. So we're really starting to see some interest in these new products, potentially from consumers that are not traditional snus users. This slide, though, frankly, is just kind of showing the writing is on the wall as well in terms of traditional snus use. So this is in Sweden, the place that snus comes from, and one of the biggest markets in the world. And you can just see how the brown line right at the top there is snus use. Usage levels, so percentage usage levels amongst adult population in Sweden, that's coming down, and very clearly we can see the light grey line there. Nicotine pouch usage is on the increase. So I think that kind of pattern is going to be happening elsewhere. We're yet to see whether in the US, for example, chew tobacco consumers are likely to switch, but I would not be surprised. And as I said, we're also starting to see new customers come in. I'm totally out of time. I'm going to just put this last slide up. What are we expecting next? I think we talked about quite a lot of these things. COVID-19, unclear yet what the permanent impact is going to have, but it's not been good for vape stores, and we're likely to see online sort of strengthen. Distribution, again, is just reflective of that. So convenience stores and online are taking up the slack. Product, we talked about pods. That's going to be the story over the next year or so, and we'll see how that develops, but very important product developments. Menthol ban, I haven't mentioned this. The menthol ban that came into Europe in May has had some potential impact, and certainly a lot of vape companies have been jumping into it, and the heated tobacco menthol brands as well have been trying to offer consumers who were using menthol combustibles to use to switch. We'll see whether that's had much impact. Heated tobacco we talked about. Brexit, I think, is just one of those things where we know it's happening. I don't think it's going to have huge immediate impact, but long term it has meant that the UK has lost really any strength in terms of policy debate in Europe, which is a great shame. I'm going to leave it there. That's a slide about tobacco intelligence. You can read in your own time. And if there are any questions, I'm going to try and answer some now, I think, and otherwise, please do come back to me, and I'd be happy to help. Thanks so much.